Welcome to this Open Security Summit session. I want to give you a quick introduction to what we're doing and what to expect. So all sessions at the Open Security Summit are live streamed or recorded, and we share them for public use. And we publish them on the Open Security Summit YouTube channel, and we highly recommend you to go there and check out these amazing sessions that we already have there from the current summit and the training session that happened before. We want you to be involved, share with your network, and please share the Zoom links that exist on the OSS website, which you can find here, and these allow you to log in straight away and see the sessions. We have an amazing content for this week, from CISO to cloud security to CDR to COVID to DevSecOps, and also a number of sessions on other topics which are super critical and important for us to address, including Wardley maps, which is a big feature of the summit. And we go every day from 10:30 till 10 o'clock at night. And as you can see, there's something for everybody here. So please be involved, participate, and join us. And just a final comment on openness and respect. At the summit, everything we do is about openness. We share the information, but also we try to release everything that is created under Creative Commons and an open source license. And we expect you to participate, to have mutual respect, to have an objective distance on your comments, and to be very professional. And finally, we put a huge focus on respect. We have a diverse community. This is about respecting everybody's opinion, and we expect nobody to feel discriminated or not comfortable during the sessions. We also support heavily the Black Lives Matter current situation that happened worldwide, because we believe that is super important to reset how we address these important issues in our society. Finally, share your views. Here's the hashtag to use, and we have a Slack environment that you can join from the website homepage and enjoy and learn. And there you go. And over to you, Mr. Simon.
Hello. First of all, fantastic call out for Black Lives Matter. I mean, I'm just going to re-emphasize the importance of the whole discussion that's going on, and this is an opportunity to change the narrative in society. So huge amounts of support for that. And in terms of recording, I've got to be professional, have I, Denise?
Nope.
That's a tough one for me.
Absolutely not. Don't worry.
Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is share some slides. Actually, before I do that, just in terms of thank you everybody for joining. Can you just give me a quick thumbs up, as in if you look at reactions at the bottom, give me a thumbs up if you've done some mapping. Okay, so quite a few of you haven't. Okay, that's cool, that's fine. Let's share then some slides. And let me make that enter full screen. Okay, so I've got a setup here, which means I have my camera and everything's main slide over here. Sorry for turning away for a little bit, but I've got a laptop down here which manages it all as well. So hopefully you can all see crossing the river by feeling the stones. Can you give me a thumbs up? Is that all? Perfect. Perfect. And by the way, as we go through this, if you've got comments, if things don't make sense or whatever, or you can't see things, please shout out. I know Denise and others are on the line. I'm sure they will interrupt me if necessary. So crossing the river by feeling the stones, it was a famous quote from Deng Xiaoping, Chinese leader. Deng Xiaoping was partially responsible for the major transformations that went on with China. This quote is all about having a direction, purpose, but being adaptive along the path. I mean, Deng Xiaoping also, there's another side, which was the whole Tiananmen Square. And but in terms of the economic play, a very interesting character to learn from. So crossing the river by feeling the stones. This is where we're going to go. I'm going to talk about the issue of strategy. Then we'll get on to situational awareness. Then I'm going to talk about maps, being trapped by context. I'm going to get into patterns. I'm going to talk specifically about agile culture, because that seems to be quite popular. And then I'm going to leave it open for some questions. There's quite a few themes we're going to go along, so there's a lot to cover, but don't be frightened. I tried to make it as connected as possible. So the first place we're going to start is the issue of strategy. And this was the beginning of my journey. So this is back in 2005. I used to work for this company, for Tango, online photo service. Had about 16 different lines of business. We were noted in the O'Reilly Web Services book. We'd converted all our basically services to web services. We were heavy users of open source. We'd adopted agile throughout the organization, probably about 2002, 2003. Of course, we'd learned by 2005 that it doesn't work everywhere. Anyway, so this was for Tango, and very profitable, revenue rapidly growing, but it had a problem. And that problem was this person in the middle. This was our CEO, our fat cat. Now, our CEO wasn't the chess playing master that you read about in HBR. They were more the alchemist, making it up as they went along. They were pretty clueless. They were fairly much a fake CEO. And I know this because I was the CEO. Now, it doesn't mean we didn't have statements of vision and strategy. We had lots of these. I mean, things like this. This is for Tango 2003. Our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. As I said, we were very much an extreme programming workshop. We'd adopted those techniques, lots of pair programming, lots of test-driven development, and we were heavy users and providers of open source. In fact, the language Perl, most of the maintainers, or many of the maintainers, worked directly for me. So we were heavily involved in the language, heavily involved in open source, heavily involved in agile. But in terms of this particular statement, I'd literally pinched it from another company and just changed a few words. That was all. So I was a little bit worried that I was making it all up. So I went around recording other CEOs talking about strategy. The idea being, in my mind, that I would be able to pick up those words and the way to do it. I hadn't done an MBA, and I was, of course, worried that people would rumble that I didn't know what I was doing. So I used to record the words, and I used to call the common words that I would hear business level abstractions of a healthy strategy, BLAS for short. It'd just be being, me being me. So these are the common words, and I've done this many times. So this is about 2013, 2014. Here are the common BLAs that I hear people talking about: digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, open source. Now, if I did it today, I mean, it'd be simpler words, but you'd also have AI, machine learning. You definitely have blockchain in there, because you can't do anything without a bit of blockchain. So these would be the sort of words that I would hear. And so I created, quite some time ago, a BLA template. Our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort at the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And then I simply combine the two together, the BLAs and the BLA template. And I've done this many times. And I simply auto-generated a bunch of random strategies. So things like this. Our strategy is customer focused. We will lead a disruptive effort of the market through our use of innovative social media and big data to build a collaborative cloud-based ecosystem. It's just pure gibberish. I mean, things like this. Our strategy is innovative digital business. And we will lead a growth effort of the market through our use of customer-focused competitive advantage and disruptive. So, I mean, again, just pure gibberish. It's just words being inserted into a template. But what I've done is I keep on sending these out. And last time I did this at any scale, I got about 400 responses back. And the responses were mainly, this is the exact wording from our business plan, or I've seen 2 of these used already. or my favorite, it was Are You for Hire? So a friend of mine's put this all online. This is basically strategy as a service. So if you ever need a strategy, just type in the URL at the bottom. It'll generate you one based upon nothing whatsoever. So our strategy is collaborative. We believe in open effort of the market through our use of big data and social media to build a digital business. It's just inserting those words. I mean, if you want, you can pretend there's AI and machine learning and blockchain, if necessary, behind it. It's really just inserting words into a template. And of course, if you don't like it, it's pretty simple. Just press refresh, and it will create you another one. Anyway, so quite some time ago, I was running this company. We were being very successful. I didn't know what strategy was, and I was starting to think that maybe others didn't know what strategy was either. I mean, I wasn't the only person faking it as a CEO. So I started reading into the subject, and I read all sorts of wonderful books, which got me nowhere. And then I was in a bookseller and a bookstore, sorry, and the bookseller said to me, "Well, have you read Sun Tzu, The Art of War?" And I went, "No." And they said, "Right, well, you should buy 2 copies." Obviously, a very candid bookseller, but there was a reason for this. It's because they're translations, and every translation is slightly different. So I bought 2 different versions, and it was in reading the second version that I noticed something. What I noticed is that when Sun Tzu talks about strategy, whoever Sun Tzu was, or it could have been many people, they talk about 5 factors. So have a purpose, a moral imperative, understand your landscape, the environment you're competing in, understand the climatic pattern, so that's how the landscape is changing, understand doctrine, so these are your principles of structure and organization, and then you're into the leadership bit, which is all the sort of tactical stuff and gameplay and strategy. And then I came across John Boyd. John Boyd, US Air Force pilot, famous for the OODA loop, which has become popular in political circles. So to explain it and to overlap the 2 together, it's not really, well, it's a set of different feedback loops. But anyway, to keep things simple, you've got the game, your purpose. The first thing you need to do is observe the environment. And that's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. So the landscape and how it's changing. Then you need to orientate yourself around this space. And that's what Doctrine is about. And then you need to decide where you're going to attack, and included in that is concepts like how you manipulate the space to your favor, and then you act. And it's a cycle, and the more you go around the cycle, the better you get at the game. You learn new patterns, you learn new principles, you learn different forms of gameplay. And at the heart of this are 2 whys. The why of purpose, as in, my moral imperative, what I'm trying to do, and the why of movement, as in, do I make this choice or this decision or that choice and that decision? And I suppose the best way of thinking about this is with a game of chess. So if I look at a chessboard, which is, it's a view of the landscape, I've got choices. Do I move piece A or do I move piece B? And it's through movement and action that we actually learn. So I learned that by moving piece B, this is checkmate, this is fool's mate. Now that learning requires us to actually perceive the environment, which is why maps are important. Okay, so this brings me therefore to the subject of situational awareness, because I've talked about maps are important. Well, fundamentally what maps are about are improving your understanding of the landscape and therefore situational awareness. Now, to explain that, I'm going to use a number of different examples. The first is Vikings. This is how Vikings used to navigate. I've taken great liberties with the text here and everything else. They used to learn epic stories. This is before we had, sunstones, etc., and primitive maps. They used to use epic stories. So you would learn, the way from London to, say, Manchester is to go past the oak tree, you know, over the hill, past the hill with the skull's face, or whatever it happens to be. I have no idea. So you learn your epic story, and that's how we used to navigate. So from Herman Head due west towards Half, navigation wasn't quite the same. And you will have sailed north of Hatland so that you just glimpse it in clear weather. Epic stories, you'd spend years learning, then you'd be in charge of a boat. Now, that epic story is roughly that. Of course, I've only shown you a tiny glimpse of the epic story, and of course, I've modified an awful lot of the text as well to sort of make sense. Okay. So the question I ask is, what would you use to navigate? Would you use a visual map, or would you use some sort of verbal story? And my answer to that is, if somebody is asking me directions to, say, the fish and chip shop, I might give them a verbal story. So out of the front door, turn left, turn right, etc., whatever it happens to be. But if somebody is asking me anything more complex, how to go from London to Manchester, or how to move many, many different units or troops, or get, you know, if you're in the lifeguard, how to get resources to somebody who, you know, to a boat that's in trouble, then I'm going to use some sort of map and some sort of coordinate system, if it's available, with that map. The thing is, what I realized about my organization is we were tending to use verbal stories for everything. And there's a problem with verbal stories. If I'm the CEO of the company and I'm going from Herman Head due west towards Half, and you will have sailed north up, so I'm giving you the epic story of what we're going to do. If you challenge the story that I'm giving you, I will tend to go, get angry, because you're challenging the story. And the problem is with stories, with the stories you have a storyteller. So, for example, you know, we spend an awful lot of time persuading people that great leaders or good leaders are great storytellers. And so when you challenge a story, you are challenging the person. You are actually challenging their leadership ability. And which is why people get often very defensive, and it becomes highly political. So let's analyze this a little bit more. This is a map of a Roman town. And there's approximately, 30-odd different points of interest. Well, there's actually vastly more, but if I just showed 30-odd, and if we described every path from A to B, so singular path, okay, in 25 words, it would take us 20,000 odd words to describe the paths, the simple paths, not the combination paths. You know, if you went A, B, C, D, if you did every possible permutation, I mean, it's billions upon billions of Wikipedias just to describe that map. But just the simple paths would be 20,000 words between those points. Now, if I give you direction in a story form, A to B, you know, 25 words, 25 words, 25 words, 25 words. And so this is a combination, not a simple, but now a combination. So we're going multiple points. If you challenge the story, you are challenging me. But if I put it down on a map, I can look at the map and go, surely that's an easier path. And the interesting thing about putting your stories down on maps is that I can challenge the map without challenging the person. Because I'm not saying the person's wrong. I'm just saying, well, looking at the map, is there another way of doing this? And so that's one of the things maps help us to do, is take some of the politics out of stories, as well as enabling us to learn and explore a space. Right, there's another example I want to give on situational awareness, and this uses that chess game. So I want you to imagine you live in a world where everybody plays chess, but no one's ever seen a board. All you've ever seen are these characters on a screen. In fact, you have no idea that a board actually exists. And you play the game very simply by pressing a button. So you press pawn, and your opponent then presses a button, say they press pawn as well. Then you counter by pressing pawn, exciting game here, and they counter, pressing queen or whatever, and the game goes on and on for ages until somebody wins, or more likely it's a draw. Now what will happen is after many, many games, we will take these sequences and start to discover magic secrets of success within it. So if you press, I don't know, knight, I should press pawn, king, pawn, bishop, or whatever, and we'll write books on the secret of the queen and the secret of the bishop, or whatever it happens to be. Okay, and so we'll put tens, hundreds of thousands of these sequences into our big data systems to declare these new patterns. Now, I want you to imagine now you're playing a game of chess against somebody who's a total novice. You're the expert. You've been playing this game for a long time. You've got all the big data systems. You've read all the books on the secret of the queen, and they're a total novice, but they see something that you don't see. They see the board, i.e. the map. And so you press a piece pawn, and they press a piece, and you see them press pawn, and you press a piece pawn, and you see them press a piece queen, and you've lost. Now, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to go, what the fiddlesticks happened there? How did I lose that game? The next thing you're going to do is write down that sequence, pawn, 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 queen, as some sort of magic secret of success. If I play that sequence, I will win. And of course, when you play that sequence, you don't know that there are many pawns. You don't know which pawn is moving, but you play that sequence, and they play against you, and they keep on winning against you. And you'll start getting like, what is going on here? You'll start thinking maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the speed at which they press the button. So you'll start recording button press speeds. That won't help you. And then you'll be like, maybe it's cultural. Maybe they're a happy sort of person or something. That's not going to help you. You're losing because they have much higher levels of situational awareness. And in fact, they will get better and better at playing the game. Until you will just lose even more effectively. So what would you use to learn? Secrets of success or context-specific play described by the environment? Well, it's obvious you would use context-specific play, but I started looking at my business and thought, well, hang on a minute, I'm using secrets of success. The top 10 secrets of successful CEOs, all these wonderful books. I am not understanding the context. I'm literally just copying others. My favorite example of this is November 2011, a Harvard Business Review, How Earlobes Can Signify Leadership Potential. It's actually, this, it's an interesting article for very different reasons, but I use this as an example of, people will read and think, maybe it's the size of my earlobes that matter. We get very, very trapped into looking for secrets of success. We should Spotify ourselves, or we should use agile everywhere. That'll make us successful. All right. So I then started to get really interested into mapping. I was looking at lots of military maps. One of my favorite is the Battle of Thermopylae. So this is Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general. You had the Greek states, and they're independent city-states, but they would come together and work together in times of war. And the problem was the Persians were invading. There are about 140 to 170,000 Persians. No one's quite sure the exact number, but it was a huge force. So what Themistocles decided to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along a coastal path into a narrow area known as Thermopylae, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force, at least to give time for the rest of the army to muster. So there were about 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans, and this is where we get the story of the 300 from. And the point about this map is, I can use the map, we can talk about the strategy, what we're going to do, where people need to go using the map. Now I want you to imagine you're members of the Athenian city. So you're part of the Athenian army. It's the eve of battle. I'm Themistocles. I'm giving you purpose and moral imperative. We want to defend against the invading horde. But then I say, I have no map. I do not understand the landscape and the environment, but have no fear, for I have created a SWOT diagram. So strengths a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses, the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities, get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian. We actually hate the Spartans. And threats, the Persians get rid of us. And the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. Okay. So the question is, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described by a map or some sort of magic framework like a SWOT diagram. Well, it's fairly obvious you'd use position and movement. But unfortunately, when I looked at my business, what I was using were things like SWOTs and magic frameworks. So that brings me back to the whole chess versus alchemy. So navigation, in the alchemy world, it's all storytelling. Navigation is much more visual in the world of things like chess. Learning, in the alchemy world, it's all about secrets of success, you know, the 10 top secrets of successful whatever. Learning in the sort of chess world is much more context specific. Strategy is all about magic frameworks in the alchemy world. You know, mix these components together and magically, woof, you've got gold or whatever. It's all about position and movement in that chess world. What I realized is, you know, there I was on the right-hand side. I was doing all of that. Storytelling, secrets of success, magic frameworks. As a CEO, that's all I did. Oh, and presentations as well. So I wanted to be over here. I wanted to be much more on the left-hand side. And I realized that what I was missing was some form of map. Okay, so that leads me now to a question, which is, what is a map? So these three images at the top, these are graphs, and they're the same. Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover. They're all identical graphs. These three maps are different, fundamentally different. And if you have a look at them, you'll see that the difference is that the maps have a compass. And that compass, what it's doing is it's giving space meaning. So, you know, if I take any one of the maps and I move a piece slightly in any direction, it changed the context. Okay. Whereas with the graphs, I can move, you know, Dover left and right, London left, it doesn't matter. They're all identical because graphs, it's just about the nodes and the connections. Whereas a map, the space has meaning. And that's meaning is really important if we want to explore. This is why maps are very good for exploring a space, because the space itself has meaning, even if it's undiscovered. Now, in my business, I had lots of maps. I had mind maps. I had business process maps. I had systems maps. But they all had one thing in common. None of them were maps. And just to explain why, we use that word all the time, but none of them were. If I take a system map and I take something like, this is a system map for one of our lines of business, and I take a component, CRM, customer relationship management, and I move it across the screen, and does the map change? And the answer is no. But if I took an atlas and I took Sydney and I moved Sydney next to London, would the map have changed? And the answer is yes. And so it doesn't change here because it's not a map. I'm afraid when it comes to business and the word maps, we keep using that word, and I'm afraid it doesn't mean what we think it means. So, what makes a map a map? Beyond space having meaning, how do we get to space having meaning? Well, first of all, with a map, you have an anchor, a point of reference. It can be more than one, but you know, at least one. So, for example, magnetic north. The second thing you have is position of pieces relative to the anchor or the point of reference. So this is north, south, east, or west of some other component. So Thebes is north of Athens. Okay, it's also west of Athens. The next thing we have is consistency of movement. So if I want to go from Thebes to Thermopylae, I have to go northwest. Okay? And northwest is a very specific direction. Doesn't change. Okay? It doesn't suddenly, northwest doesn't suddenly become south, or doesn't suddenly become east. Northwest is always northwest. So you need anchor, position, and you need consistency of movement. And of course, you need to have movement itself in order for it to be consistent. But it's not just enough to have movement, it's got to be consistency, movement as well. Okay, so what I did was I took one of my systems diagrams. They're not maps, they're diagrams, graphs if we must. And I thought, right, how do I turn this into a map? So the first thing I had to do was give it a point of reference, an anchor. So I took customer and put them at the top. Now, those customers had needs. They needed photo storage, the ability to print out images. This is back in 2005, remember. They needed a website. And each of those components have needs as well. Website needs a runtime, like a LAMP. In our case, we use the LAMP stack, but you might be using .NET or whatever stack you use. It might need other components like CRM, a logging system. It'll have, those things will require components. Like runtime needs compute. You know, LAMP stack needs to run on something. And compute needs to run somewhere, a data center. And it also needs power. There are many other components it needs as well. So what I've got is a chain of needs. Now to the customer, the website is far more visible to them than the power that's used to power the compute, which powers the runtime, which runs the website. So from a customer viewpoint, from the point of reference, the website is much closer to them. It's nearer to them. It's more visible than power, which is far away, far. It's in the distance. Okay, so what we can do is order this chain of needs on that basis. Now, what I've done is I put on the left-hand side a value chain with visible, invisible. That value chain, that axis there, it's just pure scaffold. Okay, the chain is the chain itself. It's just a reminder, metaphor to say, look, things, as things get further away in the chain, they get less visible. Right? So the website is more visible to the customer than power used in compute. Doesn't mean that power is less important. I mean, without the power, you wouldn't have the compute, you wouldn't have the runtime, you wouldn't have the website. It's just less visible. So that gives me anchor and position. But I also need movement. And so it's quite a bit of work, and I'll go through this. I eventually came up with a way of describing movement through the evolution of an act. And so I put this axis at the bottom, Genesis, custom built product, commodity. And so what I simply did in 2005 is I had my anchor and position described by the value chain, and I simply put things where they were. You know, power was a commodity, compute was more late product, online photo storage, you know, it was all custom built back then. There wasn't any products in this space. It certainly wasn't anywhere near a utility. And so this gave me a very imperfect map. And so that was the first one I produced in 2005. You may notice I've dropped off the value chain on the left-hand side. It's because it is scaffolding. The original maps, you know, never had it. I only put it there because people kept on asking, and it helped them get started. But now enough people have got started, we can just throw it away because it's really only training wheels. All right, so let's talk about movement. Because the big thing about the map is you've got the value chain and you've got these evolving points of capital. So where does that come from? How do we work out where something is? So geography, movement's pretty straightforward, unless you take a very long period of time. So this is Pangaea 200 million years ago. And as you can see, you know, the United States and is right next to Algeria, etc. Brazil's sort of in the middle there. I mean, everything's more squashed together. Now, normally, when we take a journey, if I go from Thermopylae to Thebes, the journey time is small enough that it's highly unlikely that during that time, Thebes will have moved. But, you know, if you take an enormous length of time, 200 million years, to make that journey, then of course there's the potential that things will have moved to be in different places. So fortunately for us, the time frame for our journeys are pretty short compared to the movement of the landscape itself. Unfortunately, this is not so true in the world of business. So for example, if we take the Parthian battery, that starts off 1400 years ago, and then you got utility provision of electricity, 1886 roughly, Tesla and Westinghouse. It took 1400 years to evolve. That's not 200 million. And what's even worse, if we look at something like computing, and we start with the Z3 in 1943, and then utility provision, cloud 2006, that took 60 years. And the speed of evolution of things, going from novel to more commodity, has actually accelerated every time our means of communication has industrialized. So the telephone, postage, stamp, printing press, the internet itself have all accelerated the process of evolution. So this is like 60 years. It's like setting off on a journey and discovering that, you know, you're going from Thermopylae to Thebes. And by the time you get to Thebes, you discover it's actually moved quite a significant distance. You'd have to change your means of navigation. So the way you would do that is you would have to somehow describe movement through change itself. Because it's in geography, it's quite easy because the landscapes don't tend to move. But if the landscapes are moving themselves, then you're going to have to describe your movement in respect of that change. So what I've got, and I'll take an example here, a cup of tea. So the business wants to, say, sell cups of tea. I've got two anchors here. The public has a desire to drink cups of tea. A cup of tea, it needs a cup, it needs hot water needs water, it needs kettle needs power. So I've got my points of reference, my anchor, and I've got position described in a chain of needs. And of course, you know, the power is very distant away from the user, whereas the cup of tea is very close to them. All right. So what I want to do is somehow describe this in terms of movement, in terms of change. I know that things, or capital, appear, starts off as novel, and then at some point becomes more commodity-like. Now, when I first looked at this problem, I thought, oh, this is going to be really, really easy. That's because I was aware of Everett Rogers' work. So Everett Rogers did some work on the diffusion of innovation in society. So what you've got is adoption over time. And so things spread through society through these S-curves. You start off with the early adopters, you get the takeoff of the thing, and then late adopters. And these S-curves, they're all slightly different. But it's a general pattern. It's a brilliant piece of work. And there's a chap called Geoffrey Moore, a wonderful person. He uses the non-cumulative form, okay, of the Rogers diffusion curve. So by that I mean he looks at rate adopted. So that's the one in the orange at the bottom. That's the non-cumulative form of the. If you just add them up, you get the diffusion curves. Geoffrey Moore's stuff is taken from Rogers, and what Geoffrey Moore did was add this concept of the chasm. So you have like the early market, and there's this chasm you have to jump over before you start getting into those later stages. Okay, so I thought, you know, being me, it was going to be really simple. All I need to do is find the percent adoption in the market for things to change. So things appear, we'll call them an innovation. At some point, enough people have it that we'll get a product, and then eventually it becomes a commodity. That's really simple. And unfortunately, that lasted, or that idea lasted, until I actually looked at data. The problem is this: if you ask people, I've done this many, many times, but even back in, say, 2013, 2014, if you ask people, is a smartphone a commodity? People would tend to disagree. But 2016, you can do this. But if you ask people how many people have smartphones, lots and lots of people have smartphones, 60, 70% of the market. But they all go, it's not a commodity. If you ask people whether a gold bar is a commodity, then everybody goes, yes, it's a commodity. Well, we have commodity trading markets for it. Of course, it's a commodity. It's highly standardized, etc. If you ask people what percentage have gold bars, almost nobody has a gold bar. It's very, very small. The point about this is there was no correlation, obvious correlation, between adoption and evolution. Sometimes things were still a product and weren't even commodity when everybody had two of the thing. Sometimes things have become a commodity when less than 1% had it. So at that point, I was stuck. But then what I realized was you've actually got multiple waves of diffusion occurring. So I'm a biologist by training, genetic engineer, and viruses are not only diffuse in a population, they also evolve. And it's through multiple waves of diffusion, you get this evolution. So if you think of it like telephones, I'll take telephones, you get the first diffusion, that's the first curve, A1, diffusion of the first telephone. It goes to 100% adoption of its applicable market. Then you get a better phone come out, that's A2. And it goes to 100% adoption of its applicable market. But the markets are different. And then you get A3, a new phone come out, and it goes to 100% adoption of its applicable market, and that market can be different. And you get early adopters and laggards on each of these curves, and you keep on going, and then at one of these curves, you're going to get the commodity version appear. The problem is, I don't know if it's 10, 20, 50 curves later. I have no idea in terms of timing. I don't know what the applicable market will be. I've got none of that data. So I was stuck. And then by pure chance, I started, because I collected 9,223 publications, I started noticing something. When things appear, we often, like the telephone, we often talk about, things like this, telephone, how we use it, how to talk on the telephone, hold it this way, hold it that way, speak in a clear voice. We don't tend to do that these days. When we had the introduction of electric lights, you get things like this. This room is equipped with Edison electric light. Do not attempt to light with a match. Simply turn key on wall by door. Did we do that today? No. Because these sorts of concepts have become embedded in social knowledge. So I started looking at the frequency of publication types. And what happened is when things appeared, publications would talk about the wonder of something, like the wonder of radio. Then publications would change and talk about building construction and awareness. Finally, they'd talk about operation, maintenance, and feature differentiation. Then finally, use. So things like the wonder of radio, how to build your own crystal radio set, my radio is better or worse than your radio, this radio has this feature, whatever, and finally, what's on the radio types. So there seemed to be increasing certainty going on, and so I used this to develop an axis for certainty. And I took the point of stability, as I called it, the point at where publications changed from talking about operation maintenance and simply talking about use. And I called that 100% certain. Didn't matter what it was. Fridges, telephones, whatever. I said at that point, and that point time T1, we'll call it 100% certain. We understand what this is, or at least we believe we do. And then what I did for those time T1s, and the times were all different for different activities, I went back and found the applicable market for that activity. And I call that the point of ubiquity. Now, it could be when 1% of the population had something, or for something else, it could be when 150%, i.e. everybody had 1.5 of this thing, okay? So I called that the point of ubiquity for that act. And then I just recorded back through time, traced past history against ubiquity and certainty. And for the different activities, fridges, telephones, video recorders, all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And then I simply overlaid the stages, which those publication types. So the stage 1 was the wonder, stage 2 was building construction, stage 3 was more about operation feature differentiation, stage 4 is where it's more about commodity and use. And so this was my ubiquity certainty curve: demand, supply, competition, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now the problem is stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 seems pretty meaningless. So I went back to the publications and looked in each of those stages and picked out common words. And I've had to slightly improve this. Stage 1, originally I picked the word innovation, but it's a dreadful word. So it ended up being Genesis. So for our physical activities, Genesis, custom, product, rental, commodity, utility. Practice, novel, emerging, good, and best were the words. Data, unmodeled as the best, divergent, convergent, modeled. Knowledge, concept, hypothesis, theory, accepted. And so what I've done is I've just taken the activities axis, Genesis, custom. And this is what's happening. You start off with the genesis of something, custom build examples, product, commodity. And in there, rental and utility services. And so we start off with things like the Parthian battery, custom built systems, Hippolyte Pixie. Then we get on to products like Siemens generators. And eventually we get on to Tesla, Westinghouse, utility provision of electricity. Or you take something like computing, Z3, 1943. We get on to Leo, Lions Electronic Office, custom built examples. First products, IBM 650. Rental services, things like Timshare, commodity hardware, cloud. And so that is movement. Genesis, custom built, product, commodity. Okay? And as something evolves, it goes through hundreds, if not thousands, of diffusion curves. And so often you can find things like the early adopters to products become the laggards to commodity. So if I now take my cup of tea example, that's all the map has done is put Genesis, custom. They're just better terms for stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 would be the correct terms, I suppose. But I put those labels instead because they make more sense. If you're doing practices, novel, emerging, good, and best, it's fine. In fact, on a single map, remember these are just labels for stages. So you can put activities, practices, data, knowledge, even ethical values on a single map. So here I've got my business public need a cup of tea, needs cup, needs tea, needs hot water. They put kettle in custom built and power. So I can now start challenging. I'm not challenging the person, challenging the map. Asking questions like, why is the kettle in custom built? So the first thing to remember, evolution does not equal diffusion, okay? Evolution consists of hundreds, if not thousands, of diffusion curves. You can't simply take a diffusion curve and go, oh, if it's this adopted, therefore it must be commodity. It doesn't work like that. Now, because I've got a map, people can challenge. They can go, I'm missing staff. And somebody can come along and say, staff, it should be robots. Okay, fair enough. These are diagrams of capital, which means each of them are stocks of capital. I can put each of the lines as flows of capital, and there can be all sorts of capital involved, which means I can create P&Ls out of these. Somebody can ask me, challenge, why am I using custom kettles, not standard kettles? Now, there may be a reason. There may be, somebody could argue brand exclusivity. And because now we can put the values on, we can work out what the cost of the impact of using non-standard kettles are and challenge against this idea of brand exclusivity. Point about this is we've got multiple customers, we've got a chain of needs, we've got the financial figures, we've got the ability to challenge, add different components. We've got operations to marketing to development to the business itself. And we're all talking around one map. And that was one of the big changes that happened in my company, is around the board we could sit and discuss an environment using one map. Okay. Now at this point, normally somebody says, but how evolved is something? Sorry, these are my kittens, which will be making regular appearances during the presentation. Evolution is always a touchy subject with some, but let's go back. You've got Genesis custom product commodity at the bottom of this axis. And that comes from frequency changes of publication types. So the wonder, the building, operation, and use. Now I had those 9,223 publications. And so what I was able to do was take common words for each of those sorts of publications. That's how I got to the labels. So when we talk about stage one evolution, publications tend to describe the wonder of the thing, the discovery of some marvel, a new land, an unknown frontier. The market is often described as undefined. Ecosystem, the market perception is chaotic, non-linear, domain of the very unfortunate word crazy. User perception, different, confusing, exciting, surprising, dangerous. Perception in industry, future source of competitive advantage, unpredictable, unknown, focus of value, high future worth, but immediate investment. So something like quantum computing would probably be in this sort of stage one, or maybe slightly a little bit later. Because when you look at stage two, you're now focused on building it. Construction, awareness, learning, many models of explanation, no accepted forms are Wild West. It's a forming market, an array of competing forms and different models of understanding. It's a domain of experts. It's considered leading edge, it's emerging. Uncertainty over results. It's seen as a competitive advantage. Differential, looking for an ROI in case examples. So actually quantum is probably here, whereas stage one is probably teleportation. Okay. Stage three, it's changed again. This is the era of products. Publications are about maintenance, operation, installation, comparison, growing markets, consolidation to a few competing but accepted forms, increasing expectation of use, domain of professionals, increasingly common, disappointed if not used, or available, feeling left behind. So aspects, some aspects of machine learning, for example, will be in stage three, or potentially even more evolved than that. Because then when we look at stage four, this is the commodity utility. The publications are all about use, increasingly accepted, almost invisible component. It's considered almost a mature market or stabilized to an accepted form. The perception of ordered, it may be complex behind it, although there's a world of complexity hidden behind the plug, but to us it's just the plug we switch on. User perception is standard, expecting feeling of shock if not used. Cost of doing business, accepted, specific. So things like, almost like cloud computing, utility computing, you'd say is in this space. Now this is called the cheat sheet. And I've just gone through the terms, and don't worry about trying to read this all. Stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the top. Activities, Genesis, custom, product, commodity. These are just labels for stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And these are the characteristics. And what you do is when you're looking at something, you simply go, right, let's start asking, what is it? Maybe it's a slowly increasing market, rapid increase in learning. Publications are generally talking about maintenance operation. It's also, it's consolidation to a few competing but more accepted forms, I suppose. Learning, you start literally marking off on this. This is just a hypothetical, just ticking off its characteristics. And this gives you an idea of where something is. So something like this having a bit of the stage 2, a bit of the stage 4, but mostly in the stage 3, is probably in the middle of stage 3. Okay, there is there's one issue with the evolution curve, is that it's based on ubiquity and certainty, and because of that certainty axis, you cannot precisely say where something is until it has become certain, i.e. a commodity. At that point, you can say precisely where something was. So there is no crystal ball, I'm afraid. The best you can do is to cheat the system as much as possible. And that is why you use techniques like this to give you an idea of where something is. And at least we can challenge them on that basis. All maps are imperfect representations of a space. I mean, this is a map of France. Now, in order to be a perfect map, it would have to be 1-to-1 scale, which means it would have to be the size of France, which means it would have to be France. And as a map, that's pretty useless. So all maps, in order to be useful, are imperfect representations of a space. And so it's no different with these maps. Okay. So now I've talked about strategy, situational awareness, and give you an idea of maps. We're about halfway through now. I want to talk about being trapped by context. But I suppose take a few minutes, because there's a lot to go through. Any burning questions that people have? Let me stop this for a second. If anybody's got a particular question they want to shout out or raise hands. Total silence. I can't see anybody raising hands. Let me have a look at the chat. Hang on.
There is no.
No? Okay. Well, hopefully this pace isn't too. Is the pace okay? Yes. Tick. All right. Okay. Tick. The pace is okay. Good. Okay. Right. So let's keep going. Into full screen. All right. So can you see that? Strategy, situational awareness, maps, trapped by context. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see that.
We see situational awareness, yes, trapped by.
Perfect. All right. So now let's give an example, because now we're going to go more and more deeply into maps. Okay, trapped by context. So this is an example from an insurance company. Compute, order server, server goods in, modify, mount, rack. This is their process flow. So basically what was happening is when they needed compute, they would order a server, the server would come into goods in, they would modify and mount it into their racks, and that gave them the compute they needed. Except for they had a bottleneck in terms of modification of the servers and mounting of them. So they'd spent 6 months looking at robotics. So they're going to industrialize, automate this process. Now the problem with this is if I'd gone in and said, why are you using robotics? It would have been, demon, evil, because I'm challenging their story. So you can't do that. So I asked them to simply map it. And this was like a 15-minute map. So they went, user needs compute. They put compute in product, I would argue. At that time, even at that time, it was commodity. They went order server, server goods in. That's all highly industrialized commodity-like stuff. And they went rack, mount, and modify. And the point is they've now put their assumptions down on paper. And I can look at this and I'm not challenging them, I'm challenging the map. I asked them, why did they have rack and custom built? And the answer was because they had custom built racks. They had a company that made racks for them. And so the question then became, what are the modifications you're making to servers? Well, the servers they bought didn't fit into their racks. So they had to take the cases off, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit into their racks. And that is why they needed the robotics. Now, of course, once you've got the map, it becomes pretty easy for people to go, hang on, that doesn't make sense. But it's not that people are daft. It's that people are trapped by context. They're trapped by their environments they exist within. This impacts business, it impacts security, impacts all sorts of things. So they're not daft for wanting to use robots. Their issue is they are trapped by their context. So yes, they should be using standard racks. So what's probably the most common thing I see is people trying to optimize existing process flows which have already evolved. And people spend huge sums of money doing this. Now, once you realize the rack is more a commodity, then you start saying, well, we don't need to modify it, but why do we, surely we can start challenging now on compute. And really, that's the process flow that they should be optimizing. All the rest of the stuff doesn't really matter. All right, another one. And again, remember, this is not because people are daft, they are trapped by context. And this stuff, you know, we're not talking small sums of money. We're often talking hundreds of millions, if not billions. So this is an agency, and what they do is they weigh paper forms for another department. So it turns out it's cheaper to weigh paper forms, to work out the number of paper forms filled in, than it is to physically count them. And so they use big weighing machines to do this. And they've got a digital transformation program to convert the weighing machines to more electronic. Now, you can't go and say to them, you know, argue on the story, you know, why do you need digital transformation? Immediate fight. So you just get them to map it. Now, those paper forms came from goods in. And there are distribution sites all over the country sending those paper forms to goods in. And you go to a distribution site, which is like collecting as well as sending out forms. And they've got big printing facilities. And it turns out that most of them have also got big CRM systems, which their users fill in online. So CRM and survey system. So what's actually happening, users are filling in online, whatever the question, the document is. The distribution site is then printing them out and shipping them to this other group, who are then weighing them to work out how many forms have been completed. Now, it made sense in the past when it wasn't electronic records, but when you look at this now, then you have to conclude that all of this stuff can be replaced with select count star from table, because fundamentally that's what it's doing. And does investing in digital weighing scales make sense? Not at all. So the problem is once again, they're optimizing their process flow, and people further down the chain will be optimizing theirs in terms of printing out. But in reality, paper forms have evolved, and that's the process flow they should be optimizing. So one of the first things you find with maps is once you start doing it, it enables you to challenge existing practices, existing ways of operating. But then you start to learn patterns. This is where maps really get interesting. So there are three basic types of patterns. Climatic patterns, so these are things which change the landscape, they're economic patterns. Doctrine, so these are principles of organization, and then you're into the leadership gameplay. So I'm going to start with climatic patterns. These are the rules that influence the game. So you take any map. There we are, basic map, customer, runtime, compute, data center. The first pattern you learn is that everything evolves. If there's supply and demand competition, nothing stands still. It moves from left to right. The next pattern you learn is that past success breeds inertia. So if we've been successful at something, we have resistance to the change. And that resistance can come from pre-existing practices, pre-existing capital, as in financial assets, political capital, social capital, about 16 different forms of inertia. So the classic example of this is Blockbuster Netflix. If you think about who was first with a website, it was Blockbuster. Who was first with video ordering online? It was Blockbuster. Who was first with video streaming experiments? It was Blockbuster. And who went bankrupt first? Blockbuster. The reason for this is Blockbuster had inertia created by past success, mostly late fees. That was a very successful business model. And so it wasn't a case that Netflix out-innovated or anybody out-innovated Blockbuster. They probably led the world in innovation in that space. But they had huge amounts of inertia created by past success. The next pattern you learn is efficiency enables innovation. So as things evolve and become more commodity, more standardized, more efficient, they increase the speed at which we can build novel and new things. So this is known as componentization, Herbert Simon's theory of hierarchy. So think about like building a house. It's easier to build a house with bricks and standard components. So as the underlying components become standardized, the rate at which we can build new things accelerates. And those new things are in this genesis space. So we call them the adjacent unexplored, the sort of unknown. So like utility computing enabled things like Netflix, or apps on phones and high-speed networks enabled things like OODA. So we call them, this area, the adjacent unexplored, is very much ear-be dragons. You don't know what's going to succeed. So with electricity, for example, when electricity went from product to more utility, Tesla and Westinghouse, you get an explosion of new things, including, computing, eventually computing, but you've got radio, television, but you also got things like the refrigeration blanket. That turns out that wasn't successful. Now, those higher order systems also create new sources of value or worth. They become the new industries of the future as they evolve. So all of this stuff is used in anticipation. I've shown you about 6 patterns, or 5 patterns. There's about 30 in total, which most people are pretty oblivious to. The point about them is you can take any map, and you know that things will evolve. You know we're going to have inertia. You know it will enable higher order systems, which will create new sources of value or worth. Now, the point about that is then it becomes a question of where to invest. Do I want to differentiate with the existing service? Maybe I want to build the first runtime as a utility, or the first compute as a utility, or maybe wait until somebody else plays that game, and then I'll build something new on top. So these are the questions I was faced in 2005. I estimate, I thought it was going to be Google who were going to do the compute as a utility play. Turned out next year it was Amazon. So they kicked off EC2 in 2006. Now the other thing about the map, it tells you where not to focus. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to invest in stuff which is behind the inertia barriers. Consider that evolutionary flow. You don't want to get stuck in the runtime when it becomes a utility, or data centers as compute's going to a utility. Unfortunately, if you're focused on process flow, that's exactly what will happen, which is why we end up trapped in those things where we end up, custom built racks at some point in the past made sense, okay? And people get trapped in that space. Anyway, so this is what we did. In 2005, we decided to build the first runtime as a utility. We did a big open source play around it as well, with a view of creating a market of functions. It was a billing per function. So it's what you would describe as serverless today, JavaScript front and back end. We'd already virtualized our data center anyway, based upon Zen. I was anticipating Google was going to launch a utility. It turned out it was Amazon the next year. So pretty quickly we were able to put our system on Amazon because it'd been running on our own API-based utility beforehand. And so that was Zimkey. And as I say, the first serverless environment. And so Amazon launched, and we were able to move on to that. We'd already been running for the best part of a good few months. So this is Euroscon. We're presenting it. Unfortunately, the parent company had a big consultancy come in and explain that the 3 things that we were doing, which was like cloud computing, use of mobile phones as cameras, and 3D printing, were not the future. The future was basically 3D television. And so we shut it all down, spent $1 billion roughly on 3D TVs and LCD TVs. Unfortunately, in those days, I wasn't mapping political capital, and I lost the battle. Well, they decided to listen to the consultancy firm, which was, anyway, hasn't done so well. So then I went to work for a friend of mine, Mark, at Ubuntu. And the first day I arrived, we'd had a long conversation about the transition. First day I arrived, first couple of people I met, I said, I'm going to bring you into the cloud. It was like, oh, that's a fad. It didn't take long to change people. So we knew that, you know, runtime, the platform, compute was all going to go to a utility. So there were areas that we would want to own. We also knew, or anticipated, there would be a co-evolved management tools and practice. We didn't know it was going to be called DevOps at the time, but sure enough, later that year, the term appeared. So we knew we needed to own that space as well. So we used the maps to basically direct us where to focus. So in 2008, Ubuntu, we were about 3% the operating system market. It cost $500,000, took 18 months, and we were 70% of all cloud computing by 2010. This is up against Red Hat and Windows. I mean, we just took the space from everyone. So if you remember, you know, it was all Red Hat, Windows, and suddenly Ubuntu was everywhere. You were mapped, just to tell you. I've done a lot of this sort of anticipation stuff also with government work as well. I wrote something called the Better for Less paper, which was actually for the coalition, despite the fact that I'm a member of the Labour Party. It was for Francis Ward and others to help transform UK government in terms of the IT. So it led to things like spend control and also supported the introduction of things like GDS. A lot of these days, I use this stuff for nation state competition as well on the anticipation side. Okay, so basic introduction into patterns. Now I want to talk about agile, because there's some other things I can introduce with the concept of agile. Agile seems to be appearing, well, it has been appearing a lot. So I'm going to focus on this issue of doctrine here. And these are the universally applicable principles regardless of context. So climatic patterns are patterns which change your landscape regardless of what you do. So things will evolve. You don't have to do anything, things will evolve. Okay? But those patterns are useful for anticipating changes in the space. Now, other patterns you can decide to use or not. Some of them are context specific. We call those gameplay. So open source, for example, is a great way of driving things from basically custom built to more commodity-like. It's a great way of manipulating the space. Other patterns are, you know, you can decide not to use, but they are generally universally useful. So open source, whilst it's great for industrializing, it doesn't really make a great deal of difference compared to proprietary when it comes to the genesis of new acts. Whereas other patterns like focus on user needs are universally useful. Doesn't matter how evolved something is. Okay, so these are the universally useful ones. So just to explain some of the basics of them, I just need to add a few more economic patterns. So things evolve. They enable higher order systems to appear, which create new sources of value, which then evolve. Okay. Now, as those things evolve, doesn't matter what it is, money, computing, or penicillin, its characteristics change. So on the left-hand side, it starts off as chaotic, uncertain, unpredictable, changing, different, and eventually the same thing, penicillin, becomes generic, or it becomes ordered, known, measured, stable, standard, dull. So it goes from this world of being different to being more well, it's more commodity, okay? Now, because of that, different methods work well in different spaces. So, for example, extreme programming, we'll go back to Kent Beck's original work, which is all about reducing the cost of change, is very good on the left-hand side. But it's not so good on the right-hand side, where your focus is not about reducing the cost of change, because change is not what you want. What you want is no deviation. It's industrialized utility. So Six Sigma, you know, outsourcing to somebody else who provides it in such a way is ideal. Now, know that neither of those are good in the middle, where your focus is not about reducing cost of change and not about reducing deviation. Your focus is on learning and reducing waste. So here, techniques like your Scrum, MVP, and all those other artifacts are good in the middle. So what you learn is there's no one size fits all. And generally, if you say that, people go, depends on who they are, heretic, burn. So when I say this is an agile conference and say agile doesn't fit everywhere, burn him, heretic. I do the same with the Six Sigma, burn him, heretic. It's the same as lean agile, burn him, heretic. Because everybody tells me their method works everywhere. And they also tell me why everybody else's method doesn't work everywhere. Okay. It's the same with purchasing methods. So time material based, outcome based, COTS fix, unit utility. Okay. There's no such thing as one size fits all. Multiple purchasing methods needed. So I'll give you an example of this. HS2, high speed rail. This is James Finley, CIO of HS2, high speed rail. All well-known, huge infrastructural project, over 80 billion, heading towards 100 billion. But one bit of it ended up in front of the Public Accounts Committee, being praised for being ahead of schedule and under budget. Okay, and this is the bit that James did. And this is building the entire virtual world, sorry, the railway in a virtual world, because it's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and go, whoops, we got it wrong, than it is the physical world. So they decided to build the entire railway in a virtual world, and this was under budget, ahead of schedule. It was praised. Let me explain how he did this. Got a systems diagram here. This is where he started. Multiple components connected together. And James's issue was, should I outsource it? Should I build it in-house? Should I use off-the-shelf products? Should I use a mix or a combination of them? You know, I'll outsource maybe data centers or compute. Off-the-shelf products, say for land registry, finance. Graphical information systems I'll build in-house. Okay. The problem is, the risk or the CRM, take the CRM, I'll use an off-the-shelf product. The total number of permutations in that simple diagram is about 380 million for those three. So which one do you pick? So this is the map he drew. That's the original map. Sent it to me. We made a few modifications. So this was literally done in the afternoon, Sunday afternoon. Having a cup of tea in the garden, sent it to me. And now it becomes quite easy. You outsource the stuff on the right, off-the-shelf products in the middle, agile in-house on the left-hand side. And of course, there will be some, disagreement. Maybe we'll take exceptions. Maybe the website, we may not outsource that. We may, use some sort of off-the-shelf product. Some of the content will be on the left-hand side. Okay. All maps are imperfect representations, but this was the basics of it. Now, vendors will generally hate it if you do this. And I'll just explain why. For a vendor, the ideal scenario is you outsource the whole lot, preferably in a very detailed specification. So you have no map, you outsource the whole lot with the systems diagram in a detailed specification, because you want a detailed specification because you want to know what they're going to deliver. But they want a detailed specification because they want to make huge amounts of money. And the reason for this is pretty simple. The stuff on the right-hand side can be described and will be efficiently treated in an outsourced contract because it's defined, it's known. We can write down what it is. The stuff on the left-hand side will always incur excessive change control costs because we cannot define it. We don't know what it is. We've still got to learn about it. So by putting it in a specification, you guarantee massive change control cost overruns. The same way, if you went agile the whole lot, it'd be great for the stuff on the left. It will hammer you on the right-hand side. Now, this unfortunately is what generally happens, is we get into a fight with a vendor because the change control costs are running, going up through the roof. They can point to the fact that some parts were efficiently delivered, and the bits that weren't efficiently delivered were all because you kept on changing your mind remember the stuff on the left will change anyway, and therefore it's all your fault because you didn't specify it right. And the problem is this: somebody on your side will say, next time we need to specify it better. Disaster. And you're just trapped even more by this. And just to show you just how bad this is, let's take this contract, this idea of contracts, okay? I'm going to take that systems diagram and say we outsource it all. Okay, so here's my systems diagram. What we're going to do is we're going to outsource it all, and now we're going to break it into contracts. Okay, there you are. I've broken it into contracts. And what I'm going to do is have lot one, which I've just grouped things together. Oh, that sounds engineering. So we'll put those, and all the stuff on the right sounds about user experience. So we'll put those together. And the stuff in the middle, back officey, we'll put that together. And the stuff at the bottom is infrastructure. Now I can look at this diagram. I can already tell you where you're going to fail by using the map. So that's one of the things I often get dragged into, is they've broken these into contract. I can look at the contracts, look at the map and say that contract will fail, that contract will fail. If you map this out, okay, you will find that the right sort of contract actually looks like that. And what you're doing is actually grouping together things which are similar in nature, as in we have to be treated in similar ways. Now, if you haven't got the map, you haven't got a hope. People will say, oh, I can do this without a map. All right, I'll give you an example just to demonstrate. I've taken a self-driving car, and I'm going to pretend you're from finance, and therefore IT is fairly meaningless to people in finance, or a lot of people in finance, in the same way that finance is fairly meaningless to a lot of people in IT. So what I've done is taken a self-driving car, I've taken the systems diagram, I've translated it into Elvish. There you are, that's the self-driving car, that's the systems diagram. And now I'm going to ask you questions, okay? The question is, should we outsource or build our own A? Should we outsource or build our own B? Okay, it's no different with contract structures. I'll give you a few minutes to have a think about it. Decide, should you outsource, build our own? And remember, people are making decisions on this basis continuously, all the time. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take exactly the same diagram. I'm not going to put it back into English. I'm going to keep it Elvish. And that's the mapping for. And then if I ask, should we outsource, build our own A, outsource, build our own B, and hopefully you're going, we should probably think about outsourcing A. We should probably think about building our own B. And we can then translate it back into English. You can see what it is. You know, A happens to be GPS. Fortunately, we decided not to build our own GPS. Actually, that's an interesting point for UK anyway. But the point is that simple addition of some context enables us to break things into contracts and to apply appropriate methods. So now we're not only challenging assumptions and talking about a space, and we're now looking at applying the right methods, and we're even doing some basic anticipation of change. To which, when I normally say this, then people say, but agile will evolve to be everywhere. Okay. Social practice theory, Elizabeth Shave. I'm going to use this to explain this problem. So I talk about Genesis custom product commodity at the bottom. These are just labels for stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. I could go novel, emerging, good, and best. Doesn't matter. I can just use a mix of labels. Just one from stage 1, one from stage 2. It's fine. Right. Agile development, as in extreme programming, has evolved to be good to best practice for developing novel and new things. That novel and new thing may be teleportation. That's in that category 1. So teleportation. Of course, at some point, teleportation will have built it, will evolve. Now, Lean, Scrum and MVP has evolved to be good, heading towards best practice of building stuff in that middle world. Six Sigma has evolved to be best practice for building stuff in that utility world. And here's the problem. We have a common meaning, project methodology. But we've got 3 different competencies. They're very different, but they all have the same meaning, project methodology. But extreme programming, Scrum, and Six Sigma, very different ways of doing it. And each of them is competent for one aspect of this evolving thing. Now, this evolving thing has a common meaning. It's teleportation, but it has 3 material instances. So what you've got is one competency has evolved to be good for one material instance, which is why there's no such thing as one size fits all. But what we keep on trying to do is we take one method and we co-opt bits from the other methods to make the magic method, which will apply everywhere. Okay, it will cope with both the uncharted, where we need to reduce the cost of change, and the industrialized, where we need to do the polar opposite and reduce deviation. So we've created a magic method which will reduce the cost of change and reduce change. Okay, just will not work, but we keep on doing it. And then what happens, people use our magic method and it doesn't work and it fails, and we tell them they use the wrong bits. You should have used that bit and that bit of the method, not that bit of the method. I mean, this is going very much on with agile at the moment. It's becoming hilarious. People, you know, in the agile world, they're now blaming people for using the wrong bits of agile, i.e. they're putting process over people. And agile was all about people over process. I mean, agile is becoming the most anti-agile thing there is. So this is why when I talk about agile, I'm talking right back to Kent Beck, extreme programming, very lightweight, left-hand side. So then people say, oh, well, we will Spotify ourselves bimodal. That's how we create an agile organization. It just gets even worse. So for Tango, 2005, well, actually it's before this, before 2005, this is going all the way back to 2002, some of it. There's me as the CEO. I'm breaking the organization into these wonderful silos. I had a CIO, James Duncan, CFO, CBO, CEO, and we used to get lots of fights in the silos and some fights between the silos. And so I came up with this idea of we should have product owners. This must have been about 2002, 2003. So it'd have product owners and small cells, and that would magically solve everything. All that happened is I got more fights and within the cells. So about 2004-ish, it must have been, I realized that the problem was we're trying to build new things and manage old things within these groups. So I need to split my organization into several bits, core and dev. And that caused so many fights, it almost collapsed the organization. So this is like bimodal, but 10 years before Gartner started talking about it, and it's a disaster. I'll explain why using a map. Core would build core services, dev would build new stuff. It would evolve. And then dev would turn up and say, you look after this. And core would go, where's the documentation? To which they would go, burn him, heretic, fight would start. So what was going on was nothing was evolving. And because nothing was evolving, dev would start building on new things on dev. So I was getting increasing instability in the system, as well as open warfare between the two groups. And this was all because of this missing middle. There's nothing coping with the transition. So what I did, it must have been about 2005, 2006, is we started reorganizing into chief pioneer, chief settler, chief town planner. We realized we needed 3 different attitudes, and we had aptitudes like finance and engineering would run across the lot. Okay, because it turns out it's not just, you know, engineers. Some are good in this uncertain world, and some are good in building the highly industrialized economies of scale, utility type world. And some are good at listening to customers in the middle. It occurs across marketing, finance, everywhere. So we started organizing cells which had a common attitude, pioneering cells, settling cells. And then we introduced a system of theft. So not a push mechanism, a pull mechanism. So what would happen is pioneers are building the novel anew, settlers would invade, take it over, and either throw it away or make it a better product, forcing the pioneers to get on with more pioneering. And then the town planners would invade the settlers and take over as it started becoming successful and industrialize the space, forcing the settlers to move on with more stealing. So a wonderful NHS X concept video on this as well. NHS digital concept video on this as well. So what that was doing, the system of theft, was mimicking evolutionary flow. So you took a map, you broke it down into small components with small teams, all with different attitudes, and the system of theft was driving stuff from the left to right. So we never ended up with a custom-built kettle or a custom-built rack. And for those of you who are interested, each of these groups have different characteristics, and all of them are important. Pioneers, settlers, town planners, they all need to be brilliant people, but they're brilliant in different ways, different attitudes. So pioneers are brilliant at dealing with the rare and the poorly understood. They're happy with failure and gambling. They make the impossible. They're the pathfinder, most likely to build a partially functioning 3D printer with Lego bricks. The settlers are all about growing, increasing education, constant improvement, market analysis. They're all about making success happen. They're the tactical players. They're most likely to steal the half-baked Lego 3D printer and turn it into something that people will actually want to buy. Now, the town planners, also brilliant people. They deal with the common, the world, define the essential. They're all about operational efficiency, metric driven. They build the empires of scale. We call them the war makers. They're the Amazons of this world. You turning things into a utility, left, right, and center. So they're most likely to be running, the factory which builds the Lego bricks. Okay, all of them, you need all three, and they're all brilliant people. And you let people self-select, and eventually they find where they're comfortable. If you want to know more about this, GCHQ some time ago, gosh, 2016, published Boiling Frogs. If you've not read this paper, find it online. GCHQ Boiling Frogs, excellent paper, well worth reading. Okay. Now, I do also have to put a word of warning in here, which connects back to Doctrine. Okay, I talked about Doctrine as those common economic patterns, those universally useful patterns. So there's 30 climactic patterns. There's about 40 different forms of Doctrine. There's over 100 different forms of gameplay. If I look at the Doctrine, this is a table. It's a variation of a table I've created. This was created by a chap called Steve Purkis. Well, this is modified from Steve Purkis's version. So this is the list of 40-odd Doctrine, just broken into communication, development, operation, learning, leading, and structure across the top, and phases of implementation on the left-hand side. Okay, I'm going to make this simple. Phase 1, have a common language, challenge assumptions, understand what is being considered. Okay, know your users, focus on the user needs, remove bias and duplication, use appropriate methods. Know the details. So not just high level, we need to break it down into the components. A bias towards data, having maps and sharing maps, etc. All right, those are that's the phase 1. Those are the basic things. They all sound like really obvious things to do. And once you get good at those, you move into doing phase 2, bias towards open, i.e. sharing, focusing on the outcome, thinking fast and expensive, restrained and elegant. Being pragmatic. Oh, I mean, these are so boringly obvious. Okay. That's a web engineering giant. I know some people have green, red, so I've just put it the good in blue. So this is a web engineering giant. So you can see they're pretty good at most things. That's blue. A couple of warnings around optimized flow, embrace uncertainty, no single culture, etc. Couple of warnings, are weak in other areas. Okay, that's a web engineering giant. Okay, that's a financial services company. It's a bank. It's pretty much red across the board. You can sit down and talk to them. Do you know your users? No. Do you focus on user needs? No. Do you have mechanisms for removing bias? No. I mean, just red across the board. Now, the thing is, you might say, well, how does this company survive? Because it's competing against other companies which are just like itself. So it's okay. It's all right to be hopeless as long as everybody else is. Its danger is if one of those web engineering giants come into its space, then it's got problems. All right. Now, the connection here is that when it comes to pioneer, settler, town planner, the first thing you need to do is fix your doctrine, your principles. Unless most of this is good, then you will fail if you attempt to do pioneer, settler, town planner. I cannot emphasize how important it is not to mess with organization when your principles are poor. All right, so do not do this if your doctrine is poor. Because people come to me all the time and say, oh, we want to do pioneer, settler, town planner because we hear it's like successful over here and it's going to transform us. No, it's not. It's going to be a disaster for you. Fix your principles first. To which then people say, oh, well, we just need an agile culture. Oh, gosh. All right. Krober. Despite a century of effort to define culture adequately, there is no agreement among anthropologists regarding its nature. So anthropologists have had over 100 years, and they are specialists in this subject, and they cannot agree what culture is. So if you want me to be evil, when people say to me, oh, we just need agile culture, I say, well, define what culture is, and you just watch it all go hand waving. One of my favorite, and probably one of the most fantastic anthropologists there's ever been, is Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead talked about language is a discipline of cultural behavior. Now that's a really big, important idea. The reason being is because of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So if language is part of the model of culture, you will not be able to describe culture in language. You cannot, Gödel's incompleteness theorem is basically, you cannot create a model which is complete and true, okay, within itself. So we have a problem. We have a problem is that we cannot use language itself to describe culture, and people are struggling to find what culture is. Now, remember I talked about social practice theory and the meaning and how you had competencies impacting, which were impacting different material instances. What we've got here are practices mixing with activities. And we can do that because Genesis custom product commodity are just labels, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, that's all I do. Rather than writing stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, which no one would understand, I just use these labels. But I could put novel, emerging, good, and best. That'd be the same. But I could pick any one of these labels, one for each stage. So I could go concept, emerging, convergent, accepted. Now those labels seem to be useful when looking at ethical values. So we often start off with a concept of things, and it becomes emerging, converging, until it becomes accepted, often enshrined in law. Concepts like reciprocity and fairness, the abolition of slavery. So workers' rights and civil rights both owe their history to the abolition. The workers' rights were the Knights of Labour movement. As Martin Luther King talked about, workers' rights, civil rights were the twin pillars of democracy. And then we've got laws built on top of this as well, or at least we've got concepts, emerging ideas. Now you might disagree with the position of things, but that's okay. All maps are imperfect representations of a space. You can just make the map better. Now normally, when we look at things like values, we just look at the top level values. People often don't go into what underpins this. I mean, there's Oliver Curry has done the 7 universal values, things like reciprocity, fairness, property, etc., which seem to appear in many cultures. But often we just look at the top values, and when we talk about values as a concept, so these are beliefs rather than principles, things you do, values are things you believe, we have a pipeline. We have emerging ideas like universal basic income, paid holiday. I mean, in the US, there is no law for paid holiday. It's something given by companies. So you've got certain things are in the accepted, certain things are converging. And so you have a pipeline. And I use a square to represent the pipeline. But if you start with that concept, and we start with the idea of we and me as in the individual having agency over a space, and we, belonging, needing a collective, and collectives are a pipeline from family, to the football club, to your workplace, to your nation state. What you can do is you can start to connect a number of different concepts together. And this is my very imperfect map of culture. So when somebody talks to me about culture, I say, well, I can't describe it in less than 30 or 40,000 words, but there's a map, okay? And these are the elements, very imperfectly, which make up, as far as I'm aware, and as I said, it's imperfect, culture. And it's useful for me because we're not singular. We belong to many cultures, not one. Now, I belong to my family, the place I work, my nation state, my political party, belong to many, many different collectives. We just can't copy. We can't just go, oh, look, Spotify has these values or beliefs and this structure. If we just copy those, magically, we'll have their culture, because there are many other components involved in culture. You can adopt. So in competition with others, you might adopt aspects of doctrine. Okay? But you have to apply those to your landscape, in your environment. So even though they're universally useful, when we focus on user needs, what that precisely means will vary depending on, if I'm a taxi firm or whether I'm a bank. The needs will be different. But you can at least adopt the principles. There's feedback loops, okay? So, for example, collective needs people to act in certain ways to underpin its value, okay? But those safety also is part of that, and the sense of belonging. And so if the collective has behaviors which encourages people to feel safe within that group, and then belonging to that group, it helps reinforce the values. And that can be both positive and negative. So if you look at something like online, at the moment you are seeing industrialization of mechanisms of radicalization. So things like scum media, where it's a Twitter hashtag, where you've got, people who started off with maybe slightly offensive views, or, not ideal, maybe views which some people would find moderately unacceptable, have been surrounded by a bot network which is dropping ever more extreme messaging. And of course, every time they like or support or repeat, there's something getting bombarded with likes by bots, basically. And so they're in the process of being radicalized more. So in the period of 2 months, you've got people going from concerns about things to citing revolution. Pretty extreme. You're constrained. So the gameplays that you can do depend upon the values your organization have, and also your past memory, the memory of your organization. So if I want to do a bit of misdirection, if one of the values is honesty, I can't do that gameplay. Okay, and also if there's a memory of me breaking the values, it's going to limit what I can do. So you have to really think carefully, particularly as an individual, about your behavior and about your values and how that can become embedded in the memory of the organization. An example of that is Mr. Dominic Cummings, who's created a number of problems, mostly because of this idea, this concept of the one rule. Now, so what's happening here is you've got a collective, in this case the Conservative Party, which it wants to succeed, and we define success as the diffusion and spread of our values. And the problem is with memory is if we are seen, or any group is seen to fail, then that limits and constraints the gameplay that can be done in competition with others. And we often get trapped in almost a spiral. So it can be both positive and negative. Okay. So now the sort of gameplay, the choices that you have start to become constrained. And one of them is you cannot be seen to fail. And the other problem with this is that if you don't manage to effectively deal with this, then all collectors are in competition with others. If that sense of failure appears in the memory, that can also impact the feeling of safety within that group. And that can be used both positively and negatively. You can use that to destabilize groups as well as to reinforce groups as well. So, for example, it doesn't surprise me that a whole bunch of Conservative MPs have recently been going, you know, you've got to get rid of Dominic, etc., because they're feeling that their party is being undermined by this. Now, all maps are imperfect representations of the space. They're not crystal balls. They give us an ability to write down and challenge assumptions. So at this point, people often say, oh, I'm confused. There's so much. What should I do? Well, it's pretty simple. Forget it. Forget culture, forget organization. I showed you that bit to show you how complex it is and to say, don't bother. Okay. First and foremost, focus on situational awareness. So number one, basic doctrine, focus on user needs, understand the details of what you're doing. Think small, break it down into small components, use appropriate methods, challenge assumptions, okay? That's it. So I'll just recap, sorry, I'm just gonna go back. Forget culture and organization. Everybody runs around buying ourselves when we want to agile, forget it, okay? Situational awareness. So one, focus on user needs. Two, understand the details. That's why a map is useful. Think small, break it down into small components. Use appropriate methods. Challenge assumptions. And that's it. So recap, I started off with strategy, took you through situational awareness, talked about how to map, talked about being trapped by context, okay? So maps, pretty basic, point of reference, position described through a chain of needs and movement, consistency of movement. Trapped by context, most people run with stories. And so they're often doing what seems to be very, very daft things, but it's only daft when you can see the context. And it's not because they are daft, it's because people are trapped by context. Once you start doing that, you get into patterns, climatic patterns, doctrine, and we haven't even mentioned gameplay because that's too advanced. So once you do that, I mean, some basic things, particularly in areas like agile, no such thing as one-size-fits-all methods. And I know everybody keeps on coming up with magic solutions of organization, culture, and everything else. Don't go down there. Keep it basic. Focus on the user needs. Understand the components. Apply appropriate methods. Challenge assumptions. Okay? Break it down into small components. And it's a cycle. Once you start, the more you do, the better you get. And it's there's 600 pages online, medium.com, Wardley maps. You'll read a lot more than what's here. Entire communities as well. So the only thing is really is just to start. Start by drawing a map from the point of view of the points of reference, your anchors, position, described through a chain, and movement. And that's it. So at that point, I'm going to say thank you. You've got 12 minutes left. I burnt all your 2 hours. I don't know how many people are following still, but I will just say thank you. That's where you'll find the medium. It's all Creative Commons. I've been using this stuff for 15 years. I made a Creative Commons long ago. So, please help yourself. And now we have 10 minutes left. You get to ask me questions.
Simon, we all enjoyed, I think, the session. It was really great. But the question and really struggle that I always have is about components. How to define and identify components, because visualize is really something that when you know the components, you can put the lines and improvise. But for me, always, I never find any component, even in a boiling tea or something. I don't understand even for what that, how to find out that components. Do you have any hints for that?
So yes, I do. All right. Remember,
yes.
It's a chain of needs, okay? So this needs that, needs this, needs that. Now I'm just going to share one slide. Share. Okay, and I'm going to view into full screen. All right. And can I draw on this? Oops. Oh, I want to hang on a second. Annotate. Yes. Ah, look, perfect. Right, hang on a second. Give me a second. Right. So one of the pieces of doctrine is share. And the reason being, you start off with business needs a cup of tea, public wants to drink cups of tea. What does a cup of tea need? What is it that I need to make a cup of tea? I need tea, I need cup, I need hot water. What do I need to make hot water? I need water and a kettle. What do I need to use a kettle? I need power, okay? And of course, you know, I'm missing stuff. So somebody can come along and add. So by sharing, I allow other people to help me break down, because each of these components themselves, you know, can be an entire map. Like power is an entire map itself in terms of power production and distribution with many, many different components. So the point about the map is that other people can come along, they can challenge where I've put components, they can disagree, this is here, they can argue this is over here, but they can also add other components as well. So maybe, you know, business wants more, my public wants more than a cup of tea. Maybe they want, you know, I don't know, a cake. All right, or maybe they want, you know, a nice environment or something. Environment. So they maybe several different components here, and then I can say, well, cake actually, that's more of a commodity. That's over here. Environment. Well, what does that mean? That means chairs. That means, you know, maybe Wi-Fi connection. And so what happens is you can start to expand that map out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so you encourage collaboration between the people, and also like challenging yourself with the user needs, let us say.
So let's be absolutely clear about that. Is an essential part of mapping is sharing and challenging. I mean, you know, you can try challenging yourself. The problem with challenging yourself is you'll have your own inertia and bias. So you'll sit there going, no, my map's perfect. I know things aren't going to evolve because this is how I want it to be. You need someone else to come and challenge for you. Make sense?
Sure, yes. I will think about that more, and I think I'm more closer to understand and drawing some maps soon.
So the hardest thing with mapping, I normally takes about 7 years for people to get good at mapping. The first 6 years are normally spent going, I need to do some mapping, I need to do some mapping, I need to do some mapping. And the last year is actually spent finally getting around to doing some mapping. It takes time, okay? And it is a bit of a jump into the unknown. And the one thing I will say, if you don't find it useful, stop. Okay, don't do things you don't find useful.
Thank you.
Pleasure. So apologies, I've got 2 screens here and I occasionally flick away, so sorry about that. Is there more questions?
Everyone is really very happy and saying thank you for the great session.
Oh, pleasure.
Really, audience, here we have great chance and we have Simon with us. Please feel free to give questions. You will not have this kind of opportunity, might be sooner.
Well, I'm doing several more sessions today and several tomorrow because Denise has signed me up to everything. So you can ask me questions as well as we go along. More than happy. Hello.
Hi, it's Sarah Clark here. Brilliant session, thank you. I'm somewhere in that 6 years of going, yeah, that looks like a really fine idea. I'm really interested in that finding components question, but with processes, because yeah. I kind of get the things that are needed and then sharing with people who can surface other components for you, like the staff in the T example. But my specialist area is vendor governance for security and stuff like that.
Okay.
The sort of my broader professional area. And I've tried to simplify processes there to solve a lot of the culture kind of problems you've brought up. Okay. You know, not outsourcing problems and not thinking you're going to make your money back if you outsource complexity. So can you give similar tips for a process?
Gosh, that's an interesting one. So to show you how broad mapping has gone, I mean, Mark Craddock, myself and others at the UN started with reducing global poverty. And what does that need? And went through all sorts of components. So often I will take a processing. You get business process maps, and I'm thinking like the insurance company here. Well, that's just that process flow. But the thing is, you sit there, and it's an interesting one, because often we have processes, and people haven't actually, within the process, it doesn't seem to specify who the user needs are. So it's often an exercise of going, okay, well, why does this process first of all exist? What is it? Who are the users? What are the needs that we're trying to achieve with this process? And then it's a question of just saying, from my point of view, is going, okay, well, if our goal, so if I start with something like rural payments, we've got the European Union has a need to change farmers' behavior. Farmers are another. Oh, I should draw. Hang on a second. I can't do this.
I recognise that urge.
Yeah, I can't do this with words, so I have to draw. So can you all see a whiteboard?
Yes, we can see the whiteboard.
Yep.
Yes. Oh, good. Right. Okay. So let me just erase that. Right. So let's draw a line. Green. No, wrong. Hang on. 2 seconds. I'll be there. Aha. Right one. Correct. Right. Now we've got a line. Let's change to something else. Red. Yeah. Right. So we'll start off with Genesis. Custom. Product. I should have built a template for this. Commodity. So we start on, I don't know if this is going to answer the question, but we'll start off with, say, EU, what has a need to change behavior. So we'll put behavior, and we'll put farmers. Farmers have a need for, and you can see my handwriting is awful. What do they have a need for? Money, 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 money. They like, right, money. Okay, right. And that behavior needs money, right? So you're going to pay people. And then you've got the Scottish government, which is providing that money. But it wants the money back from the European Union. And so that's going to require some sort of auditing system. And that's auditing system that's going to require, and this is a pipeline, some sort of business process rules, and we can go and map out the connection of those. So things like on one side, how big is your farm? So how big is your farm is maybe big is over here, and over here might be diversity in the hedgerow. And the reason why that process is over in Genesis is we're still trying to work out what it is and everything else. So is this helping at all?
It is. Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm thinking in my world of vendor change that you've got tension between people trying to get stuff into production. You've got the Bright Ideas Factory who are trying to get stuff to the point where it can be put through the change process into production. You've got the people doing the assurance in the interim. So yeah, I'm kind of overlaying that with what you're doing.
So the interesting one about this is this particular project, the rural payments, it's failed several times because they've tried to build one all big, all singing, all dancing project. Then they've because it keeps on failing specification changes, then they've bunged on like AI, and the AI will magically, and that's failed as well. And the
problem, blockchain, that's why they're failing.
Oh yeah. Oh well, the issue, pretty easy to resolve actually, is that in reality they can build this bit as a system, and what they need is this bit is manual processes. So what you do is here you hire civil servants. Oh God, my handwriting's dreadful. And here this is actually a system. So one of the most common problems, sorry, not one, a common problem I see is people trying to build like these all-encompassing systems, which at one side are dealing with highly industrialized things or things which should be like how big is your farm? We can do that on a map and measure it, etc. And that's well defined, well understood. But mixing it in with things like, how diverse is your hedgerow, which we haven't even worked out quite what that means. So often one of the big problems that I see is people combining the two, and it can be usually done by just breaking it into multiple components. One manually, in this case, hire lots of civil servants, and one the system. Sorry, my handwriting is so awful. I need to improve my handwriting.
Thank you. No, that's really helped, honestly.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very kind. Any other questions?
So if no other questions,
I get to go have a cup of coffee and prepare for my next talk. And I'm going to say thank you to everyone.
Yeah, and everyone saying thank you to you, Simon.
Pleasure.
Recording, and we will meet you again in other sessions, and all looking forward for that. So thank you, thank you. I will stop now.
Actually, wait. I think the idea was for Simon just to record a very quick debrief of the session, a couple of minutes. Just
Okay. We'll do that on the fly. Hang on a second. Hang on. We'll go. I can't do a. And hang on a second. Do I want to change? Okay, I'll count down from 3, 2, 1. Okay, in this session, we're going to learn about why you should forget about culture and organization and concentrate on situational awareness. To make it simple, focus on the user needs, understand the details, think small, use appropriate methods, challenge assumptions. To understand more, come and listen to the session. Thank you. How was that?
Brilliant.
Thank you. So thank you.
Pleasure.
All right, Simon. So have a good lunch, and I'll see you at 2.
Yeah, see you then. Okay, you take care.
Yeah, brilliant. Bye.